in the very soul of Renaissance Florence, where art and elegance blossomed more vividly than anywhere else, one man would transform this beacon of culture into a nightmare. His name was Girolamo Savonarola, and for 4 harrowing years, he reigned over Italy's most splendid city through religious zealotry. The same throngs that would later demand his death had once bowed before him as if he were divine. But authority rooted in terror and extremism cannot endure. And when it collapses, it does so with the same ferocity that marked its rise. On May 23rd, 1498, dawn broke over Florence's Piazza della Signoria, casting long shadows over the stone streets, where an immense crowd had assembled. They gathered not in reverence, but to witness the downfall of the man who had once dictated the rhythm of their souls. On this day, the so-called prophet would meet the fire. The despot, who had incinerated priceless artworks, sacred texts, and human hope, would now be consumed by his own flames. Those who had once cowered beneath his sermons now craved the sound of his suffering. This is more than an account of a man's death. It is a cautionary tale of how unchecked power corrupts entirely, of how terror becomes a tool for mass control, and of how those who invoke divine wrath to govern will ultimately fall by the very means they employed. The rise and fall of Girolamo Savonarola is a stark reminder that history's most perilous leaders often arrive cloaked in virtue, offering redemption while sowing destruction. In the late 1400s, Florence stood at the crossroads of 2 eras. The Renaissance had elevated the city into Europe's cultural heart, nurtured by the powerful Medici family, who sparked a flourishing of art, philosophy, and literature. Lorenzo de' Medici, celebrated as Lorenzo the Magnificent, turned Florence into a model of splendor. Michelangelo gave life to stone. Botticelli painted divine visions, and intellectuals rediscovered classical antiquity's wisdom. It was a period of unmatched wealth and creative brilliance. Yet, beneath this shimmering surface, ominous undercurrents stirred. The Catholic Church was plagued by corruption. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, openly kept lovers and auctioned ecclesiastical offices to the highest bidder. To many faithful believers, the Church no longer represented spiritual truth but moral decay. Ordinary citizens, though mesmerized by their city's beauty, grappled with hardship, disease, and disillusionment. They yearned for genuine spiritual leadership, for a voice brave enough to challenge authority and cleanse the rot that touched every corner of their world. It was into this turbulent environment that Girolamo Savonarola emerged, a Dominican friar whose youth was shaped by personal failure and abandonment. Born in Ferrara in 1452, Savonarola turned to the church after the heartbreak of losing the woman he loved, whose family rejected his proposal. His earliest forays into preaching were marked by failure. Eyewitnesses recalled him as unpolished and uninspiring, with a grating tone that repelled rather than inspired his listeners. But rather than breaking him, these early disappointments forged an unwavering resolve. He became a man unwilling to yield or compromise with what he saw as a deeply corrupted world. A pivotal shift occurred in 1490, when Savonarola returned to Florence and began delivering sermons at the convent of San Marco. He was no longer the faltering orator he had once been. Years of struggle had ignited a fervor within him, and now his preaching radiated with fierce, apocalyptic urgency. He claimed to have received divine visions foretelling God's impending wrath upon Italia judgment, provoked by the church's decay and the vanity infecting Renaissance life. His once unimpressive voice now echoed through the cathedral, warning of floods of blood, invading armies from the north, and a celestial judgment that would divide the saved from the damned. What lent extraordinary weight to Savonarola's warnings wasn't just their fiery tone, it was their apparent truth. In 1494, only 4 years after his return, France's King Charles VIII invaded Italy, cutting through defenses with ease. Florence's ruling Medici family abandoned the city in chaos as their regime crumbled overnight. To the panic-stricken populace, Savonarola's words now seemed prophetic. He had predicted what no strategist or politician had foreseen. If he was right about the invasion, what else might he know about God's intentions for their future? With the Medici gone, a void opened, and Savonarola and his swelling ranks of disciples quickly stepped in to fill it. What began as a spiritual awakening rapidly mutated into an oppressive theocracy that would make even the Spanish Inquisition seem restrained. Declaring that Jesus himself was now the ruler of Florence, Savonarola positioned himself as the divine monarch's earthly proxy. This wasn't just metaphor. The friar exercised real influence over the city's republican government, dictating laws and reshaping society through the lens of his uncompromising faith. Florence changed with alarming speed. The city once hailed as the Renaissance's crown jewel turned into a fear-ridden dystopia, where spies reported every whisper and citizens feared being denounced. Savonarola assembled groups of children into roving squads of moral enforcers. These young zealots merely raided homes to confiscate and destroy any item considered vain. Perfumes, jewels, luxurious garments, secular books, music, and paintings. Empowered by their leader, these children could ruin lives with a mere accusation. The most infamous symbol of this religious despotism was the Bonfire of the Vanities. These grand spectacles, held in the Piazza della Signoria, forced citizens to surrender their possessions to towering infernos that engulfed the city's skyline. Priceless manuscripts, unique works of art, and generations of cultural legacy vanished in flames as Savonarola's disciples chanted hymns and thanked God for the purging. Even Botticelli, the renowned artist behind the birth of Venus, was swept up in the religious frenzy, sacrificing some of his own masterpieces to the blaze. The birthplace of the Renaissance was now annihilating the very heritage that had once elevated it. But it wasn't just objects that burned. Human beings also fell victim to the fires of fanaticism. Savonarola's sermons grew ever more unhinged, advocating brutal punishments and executions for sodomites, heretics, and anyone who dared to oppose his authority. He built an intricate web of surveillance, turning neighbor against neighbor, and even children against their parents. Public whippings became a familiar sight, and the fear of death loomed over anyone deemed insufficiently devout. Prostitutes were expelled from the city, artists were silenced, and scholars were left to choose between exile or submission. The psychological toll on the citizens of Florence was profound. A society once alive with creativity and personal expression devolved into one defined by repression and fear. People shuffled through the streets with their eyes lowered, terrified that any display of joy or prosperity might be judged as sinful excess. Smiles were suspect, beauty became temptation, and intellectual pursuits were viewed with distrust unless they conformed to religious dogma. The vibrant humanism that had made Florence a beacon of the Renaissance was slowly being extinguished by a man who claimed divine sanction. Still, as Savonarola tightened his authoritarian hold, the first signs of his downfall were beginning to appear. His unchecked influence eventually brought him into a head-on clash with Pope Alexander VI. Although initially tolerant of the friars' reforms, the Pope soon became the target of increasingly pointed denunciations. Savonarola's sermons began to include thinly veiled accusations aimed at the Pope's personal corruption. When he boldly proclaimed that Alexander VI was an illegitimate pontiff and urged the formation of a council to depose him, Savonarola crossed a dangerous line. The papal response was swift and strategic. In May of 1497, a formal papal bull excommunicated Savonarola and placed Florence under interdictus spiritual lockdown that cut the city off from the church's sacraments and threatened the eternal salvation of every Florentine. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare intended to turn the city against the friar. And it worked. If Savonarola truly spoke for God, people began to wonder, why would the Pope God's earthly representative cast him out? The seeds of skepticism, once sown, quickly blossomed into widespread disillusionment. Savonarola's reaction to his excommunication laid bare the full depth of his delusional self-importance. Instead of seeking forgiveness or displaying humility, he declared the Pope to be the Antichrist and claimed that the excommunication held no divine authority. He continued to perform Mass in open defiance of the ban and encouraged his followers to disregard the papal interdict. To his most fervent supporters, this stance may have seemed like noble defiance, but to much of Florence, it looked like the ramblings of a man who had let arrogance eclipse his judgment. How could a man who claimed to be God's servant so brazenly oppose the head of the church founded by Christ? As both ecclesiastical and civic pressure mounted, Savonarola grew increasingly desperate to validate his divine claims. In April 1498, he consented to undergo a trial by ordeal fiery test that would allegedly confirm divine endorsement. If he emerged unscathed from walking through flames, it would serve as heavenly validation of his mission. Thousands gathered in the Piazza della Signoria to witness this dramatic event. But when the decisive moment arrived, Savonarola faltered, ultimately refusing to proceed through the fire. His supporters blamed Wetwood and demanded a delay. But the damage to his credibility was already done. That failed trial marked the beginning of the unraveling of Savonarola's religious dictatorship. The man who had demanded unwavering belief had revealed that his own convictions had limits. When faced with literal fire, the prophet who had promised divine protection chose retreat. The crowd that had anticipated a miracle instead saw a leader unwilling to risk what he had asked others to sacrifice. Grumblings of doubt that had simmered in private now erupted into public denunciation, as Florentines began reassessing the friar's legitimacy. Just days after the aborted ordeal, public sentiment had turned firmly against Savonarola and his movement. Freed from the grip of fear, Florentines reflected on all they had lost under his regime. They recalled the paintings destroyed in bonfires, the forbidden books, the neighbors silenced or exiled. The proud intellectual and artistic identity that once defined Florence had been crushed by a man whose only real talent was inciting terror. On the 8th of April, 1498, a furious mob assembled outside the convent of San Marco, where Savonarola had sought refuge. The site that once served as his stronghold had become his prison as hundreds demanded his surrender. Though his loyalists attempted to defend him, they were outmatched. Hours of street fighting culminated in the convent's breach. Savonarola was dragged from his chambers by the same townspeople who had once treated him as a divine messenger. The man dragged from San Marco looked nothing like the once imposing figure who had dominated Florence from the pulpit. 4 years of unchecked authority had left their mark, aging him far beyond his 45 years. The face once lit with zealous fervor now betrayed only bewilderment and dread. As he was delivered into the hands of secular justice, the self-proclaimed prophet of divine visions appeared simply as a terrified, middle-aged man finally ensnared by the consequences of his own deceptions. Yet Florence would not settle for mere captivity. The city, still reeling from the weight of Savonarola's rule, demanded a full reckoning. And they would extract his confession through the very means he had once sanctioned. The man who had consigned countless others to the torture chambers now found himself subjected to the same torment, discovering that the brutal methods used to force confessions from heretics worked just as effectively on those who claimed to speak for the Almighty. Interrogation began immediately after his capture, carried out beneath the Palazzo Vecchio, under the watchful eyes of both civic and ecclesiastical officials. The chosen method was the strappado, a torture device perfected during the Inquisition and renowned for its ability to shatter even the most resilient resolve. Savonarola's hands were tied behind his back and connected to a rope threaded through a pulley. He was hoisted skyward by his arms, with his entire body weight tearing at joints not meant to bear such a burden. The lifting alone inflicted searing pain as his shoulder joints began to tear apart. But the real agony came when the executioner abruptly released the rope, causing Savonarola to plunge downward, halted only by the sudden jerk of the cord. The resulting sound, the snapping of ligaments, and the grinding of bone filled the chamber. Each drop sent unbearable pain coursing through his body, slowly dismantling his shoulders while nerve endings screamed in protest. Eyewitnesses recorded the echo of Savonarola's cries reverberating through the palace as the ordeal stretched on for hours and days. The man who once glorified suffering as a path to purification now tasted the agony he had inflicted on others. His tormentors, some of whom had lost loved ones during his regime, showed no leniency as they applied the brutal tactics he had once defended. Between sessions, he was returned to a cramped cell barely large enough to stretch out, where infection and fever worsened his misery. But the psychological torment may have been more ruinous than the physical torture. Savonarola's very identity was built upon the belief that he channeled divine wisdom's unwavering conviction that he was God's voice on earth. Yet as the torture wore on and no divine rescue arrived, Savonarola's once unshakable faith began to fracture. Where was the God who had chosen him as his mouthpiece? Why did his desperate prayers go unanswered? The deafening silence from the heavens inflicted a deeper wound than any lash or dislocation. After 2 relentless weeks of torment, his body and soul were shattered. His arms dangled uselessly at his sides, twisted and disjointed into grotesque shapes. His voice, which had once dominated an entire city, was now a rasping whisper. But the most crushing blow was to his faith, the very pillar on which his identity had been constructed now lying in complete collapse. The confession he eventually gave was a complete renunciation. He admitted that his visions were falsehoods, that his prophecies stemmed from personal ambition rather than divine insight, and that he had misled Florence for the sake of his own glory. But this disgraceful admission was not enough to appease the city's thirst for vengeance. The trauma endured during his despotic rule could not be healed by mere imprisonment or banishment. Florence wanted blood, and they would have it in the most theatrical and degrading fashion possible. Savonarola would perish in the very square where he had once staged his infamous bonfires, the same place where irreplaceable works of art, literature, and heritage had been reduced to ash. Now, the fire would take the man who had lit them. The execution was set for May 23rd, 1498, allowing time for a public spectacle to be prepared. In the heart of the Piazza della Signoria, carpenters built an imposing scaffold, visible from all sides of the square. A gallows was installed, and beneath it, piles of dry wood and kindling were arranged to create a blaze powerful enough to obliterate not only flesh and bone, but the memory of the man himself. This was not to be a swift death, but a carefully choreographed torment, designed both to entertain and to serve as a lesson to others who might one day seize power through fear. News of the impending execution spread swiftly through Tuscany, drawing crowds from far and wide. They didn't come in pity for the condemned friar, but driven by fascination to witness the collapse of a figure who had once wielded such merciless control. Shopkeepers shuttered their businesses, farmers left their lands, and aristocrats descended from their estates, all eager to witness the finale of a saga that had mesmerized an entire nation. By sunrise, the square was overflowing with people, a vast sea of onlookers, united in their desire to see retribution fulfilled. The mood was celebratory, not somber, more carnival than crucifixion. Food vendors roamed among the crowd, selling wine and snacks to eager spectators, while thieves mingled unnoticed through the throngs, and prostitutes, the same women once exiled by Savonarola, boldly resumed their trade as an act of rebellion. Children who had once patrolled the streets in his name now pelted the execution platform with stones and curses. The city that had endured 4 years of repression was now reveling in its liberation, and that jubilation would be consecrated by the blood of the man who had stolen its joy. At sunrise, when the prison doors creaked open, the man brought out bore no resemblance to the firebrand preacher who had once gripped Florence in fear. Savonarola, now broken in body and spirit, had to be carried out his frame, too shattered to stand on its own. His arms dangled at unnatural angles, clearly fractured and clumsily set. His face, once inflamed with moral indignation, was pallid and etched with suffering. Most haunting of all was his silence. The voice that had once roared from every pulpit was now mute, whether from ruined vocal cords or from sheer mental collapse. The procession to the scaffold moved at a deliberate pace, giving onlookers every chance to hurl their rage at the man who had once ruled their lives through fear. Guards struggled to maintain a barrier as townspeople surged forward to spit on him, beat him with sticks, and spew venomous insults. Some hurled decaying food and excrement, while others shrieked their hatred until hoarse. This was no solemn march to a noble death. It was the pitiful end of a tyrant facing the reckoning he had denied so many others. Upon arrival at the execution site, Savonarola was stripped of his humble friar's robe, left bare before the very crowd that had once idolized him. This calculated degradation stripped him of any residual dignity, exposing him as nothing more than a broken man of flesh and bone. The preacher who had denounced beauty and championed humility now stood as a frail, defeated figure, a stark image of the mortality he once cloaked in divine rhetoric. His execution was crafted to be a spectacle of layered torment. First, he would be suspended by the neck, just enough to rob him of consciousness without delivering death. Once revived, the process would repeat until the executioners deemed his suffering sufficient. Only then would they ignite the pyre below him, ensuring he was alert enough to endure the agony of being consumed by fire. This was not mere capital punishment, it was theatrical vengeance tailored to sate a city's long-suppressed fury. As the noose tightened around Savonarola's neck, he made a final attempt to speak, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a last declaration of innocence, but his voice was too faint to rise above the roaring crowd. Whatever words he managed were swallowed by the chaos of shouting and applause that erupted as the executioner readied himself. The man who had once silenced thousands with a single gesture now found himself voiceless amid the clamor of those he had ruled through terror. Even his final moments were stripped of the dignity he had denied so many others. The first hanging was swift, serving only to illustrate the executioner's absolute power over life and death. Savonarola's body thrashed at the end of the rope, his skin turning ashen and his eyes bulging grotesquely. The crowd erupted in cheers as he slipped into unconsciousness, but their revelry was premature. This was only the beginning of his torment. Once lowered and revived, the ordeal was repeated, each cycle drawing fresh cries of anguish from the condemned and renewed waves of delight from the masses. By the third round, Savonarola was barely conscious, his body racked with spasms. Only then were the torches brought forward and set to the dry kindling beneath the scaffold. The flames caught instantly, stoked with pitch and seasoned wood prepared to ensure an intense blaze. As the fire climbed, the crowd surged forward, straining to witness every moment of the execution that would finally sever Florence from the grip of its former theocratic oppressor. The scent of burning timber was soon overtaken by the sickening stench of scorched flesh as the flames reached Savonarola's feet and began to consume his body. Despite the fire's crackle and the noise of the crowd, his screams, feeble but unmistakable still, pierced the air. Eyewitnesses later recounted that his lips continued to move, as if mouthing prayers or verses from the same psalms he had once wielded to sow fear. But if the heavens heard him, they offered no reply. The blaze raged on for hours, devouring not just Savonarola's body, but the scaffold and gallows as well. Still, the crowd refused to disperse, unwilling to leave, until every trace of the man who had tormented them had vanished. Parents hoisted children onto their shoulders for a better view. Women who had once surrendered their adornments to his fires now watched with grim satisfaction as he was claimed by his own purifying flames. To them, this was not cruelty, it was justice at last. When the fire had finally burned down to glowing embers, the authorities performed one last act to ensure that Savonarola would never rise again, symbolically or otherwise. They gathered his ashes and any fragments of bone that had survived the flames and cast them into the Arno River, the same waters that had once carried away the remains of the Vanities he had ordered burned. This was not mere disposal. It was a calculated obliteration, aimed at eliminating any trace of his existence. They feared, even in death, that relics of Savonarola might spark renewed devotion or claims of martyrdom. The authorities were determined to prevent his memory from being turned into a rallying point for future zealots. As the sun dipped below the rooftops of Florence, the crowd began to thin, but the jubilation did not end there. Across the city, in inns and private homes, citizens celebrated their release from years of oppression. Laughter returned to streets that had long echoed with whispers and fear. With the tyrant gone, Florence breathed freely once again. Artists came out of hiding to reclaim their craft. Scholars retrieved banned books, and everyday people dared to enjoy simple pleasures: music, color, laughter without dread. But the arc of Savonarola's life and fall holds meaning far beyond the narrow alleys of Renaissance Florence. His evolution from scorned cleric to authoritarian ruler illustrates how fear and uncertainty can be weaponized by persuasive figures. The Florentines, among the most cultured and educated people in Europe, succumbed to a man who offered divine order in exchange for blind obedience. The rapid rise of Savonarola's theocracy serves as a cautionary tale for any community that values liberty and pluralism. In a matter of months, Florence was transformed from a beacon of creativity into a city ruled by fear. Children became informants, neighbors were driven apart, and trust was replaced by suspicion. The city's once robust civic institutions, its merchant guilds, its republic, its legal safeguards were all swept aside by one man's claim of heavenly endorsement. Most unsettling of all was how swiftly the people adapted to their new reality. Citizens who had once enjoyed a measure of personal freedom came to accept surveillance, censorship, and public punishment as part of life. They rationalized their submission by believing it served some higher spiritual purpose. The belief that destruction and control were needed for salvation helped justify atrocities. This complicity reveals how moral people can fall prey to oppressive ideologies when they relinquish their judgment to a charismatic figure. The psychological methods Savonarola employed keeping the populace in a state of crisis, vilifying external and internal enemies, demanding loyalty not to ideals but to himself, have been echoed in authoritarian regimes across the centuries. From inquisitorial courts to modern despotisms, the pattern is strikingly familiar. Those who claim sacred insight often use it to justify ruthless control over others. Savonarola's manipulation of children as enforcers in his regime offers a chilling echo of tactics used by future totalitarian states. By forming youth brigades tasked with policing morality and reporting even their own families, he undermined the most fundamental societal bonds. In a world where children feared their parents and parents feared their children, the family, traditionally a refuge from the intrusion of the state, was transformed into a tool of coercion and betrayal. The widespread destruction of art and knowledge in the infamous bonfires of the Vanities was more than an act of zealotriet, was a direct assault on the soul of a civilization. Throughout history, despots have known that creativity, beauty, and independent thought are dangerous to their authority. By erasing the masterpieces and literature that inspired cultural pride and individual expression, such rulers disconnect people from their history, making them more reliant on the promises of a future defined solely by their ideology. Yet, Savonarola's dramatic downfall ultimately exposed the fragility of a regime sustained by fear and illusion. His perceived divine mandate only held as long as the public continued to believe in his supposed connection When that belief faltered first through papal condemnation, and later his failure to prove divine favor in a trial by fire, his grip crumbled swiftly and completely. The same crowds that once hailed him as a holy figure now turned on him with the rage of those who recognized their own gullibility. The cruelty of Savonarola's death, though disturbing by modern ethical standards, mirrored a medieval concept of justice as spectacle. For the citizens of Florence, only a highly visible and painful punishment could atone for the suffering he had inflicted. They saw his public execution not merely as retribution, but as a necessary restoration of moral and social order. The dramatic nature of his torture was calculated to both avenge and deter. Contemporary audiences may find such revenge hard to justify. No matter how severe Savonarola's offenses, the physical torment he endured, the prolonged cruelty of his execution, and the intentional stripping of his dignity raised difficult ethical questions about justice and its limits. Yet, in the eyes of the Florentines, he was not just a criminal, but a destroyer of culture and trust, a man whose reign had cost the city dearly. In the wake of his death, Florence experienced a striking rebirth. Artists emerged from the shadows and resumed their craft, producing some of the most celebrated works of the Renaissance. Intellectuals returned to their studies of classical thought, and the marketplaces came alive again. Festivals and music filled the streets once more. It was as if the city, released from a long nightmare, rediscovered its heartbeat. It was as though Florence had emerged from a 4-year nightmare to find that the world of art and knowledge it had lost could still be restored. Yet the wounds inflicted by Savonarola's rule ran deep. Families, shattered by betrayals, found it difficult to rebuild trust. Artists, who had destroyed their own creations during religious hysteria, mourned the loss of their expressions, and the children once used as instruments of repression carried emotional scars that would shadow them for life. Florence had learned a sobering truth. No matter how enlightened a society may seem, it remains vulnerable when confronted with organized extremism. The broader consequences of Savonarola's ascent and collapse rippled through Europe long after his death. His confrontation with papal authority foreshadowed the Protestant Reformation, which would divide the Christian world just 2 decades later. His manipulation of popular piety to gain political control offered a dangerous blueprint for future revolutionaries and autocrats. His campaign against culture showed how fragile artistic and intellectual achievements can be when threatened by ideologies that view them as heretical. More significantly, Savonarola's saga stands as a powerful reminder that the cost of liberty is unending vigilance. The Florentines who lived through his rule learned that freedom, once forfeited, is far harder to reclaim than it is to safeguard. They came to understand that the very attributes that elevate a society, its openness, its embrace of innovation, and its faith in humanity's better nature, can be exploited by those who seek power through manipulation and fear. Though the ashes of Girolamo Savonarola were cast into the Arno River 500 years ago, the echoes of his life and demise still speak to every age that cherishes liberty over oppression, pluralism over doctrine, and creativity over tyranny. His story endures as both cautionary tale and beacon of hope, a warning about how swiftly a society can slip into darkness when fear overrides reason, and an affirmation that the human spirit, driven by a yearning for truth and beauty, cannot be forever subdued by despotism. Ultimately, Savonarola's true legacy lies not in the regime he imposed or the fear he spread, but in the cultural rebirth that followed his fall. The artworks he sought to erase were succeeded by even greater triumphs. The knowledge he tried to silence became the bedrock of centuries of enlightenment. The soul he tried to suppress rose from the pyre of his execution and built a world richer and freer than he ever believed humanity deserved. And in that lies perhaps the most fitting justice for a man who viewed human nature as irredeemably corrupt and unworthy of joy, beauty, or the freedom to choose its own path.